A little bit of my background. I originally trained as a research psychologist, researching cognition in depression and the effects of psychiatric medication, namely selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressants. And then I trained as a psychoanalyst. It's a bit of a myth. Many psychoanalysts don't see themselves as mental health professionals. And, well, hopefully my talk might shed some light on as to why. But it's far too complex a topic to discuss in a few short minutes. But I'll give you my worries about mental healthism. Mental health, it's a phrase that everybody uses without thinking. Yet when we subject it to critical analysis, we can see how slippery a term it is. It's a term that reduces and reifies human experience to simple categories of good and ill mental health. Today, political activists from all political persuasions often campaign for more or improved mental health services. It is simply seen as a good thing. There is almost no interrogation of the concept of mental health from a critical, psychoanalytical, or philosophical, or even rarer, a spiritual perspective. The uncritical acceptance of the idea of mental health has damaging consequences. Chiefly, the mental health agenda forces people to think of the problems they experience as purely psychological problems, a psychopathologization of ordinary life and experience. This is compounded and perpetrated by the discipline of psychology itself, which purports to be a neutral science. As Sylvantia Boyne, I think I've pronounced that correctly, argues in her book Another Freedom, psychology, rather than contesting the states of alienation and confusion, exaggerates these states and celebrates them in a positivist carnival of inauthenticity. Indeed, alienation from ourselves is positively encouraged through psychobiological frameworks, including genetic theories, which permeate the discipline of psychology and dispute and destabilize ideas of free will and responsibility, and which negates the idea that the wide range of human emotions and experience are actually perfectly normal. The crucial problem with psychology and its contemporary underpinning, the idea of mental health, is that it views human beings as essentially machines. And machines, as everyone knows, become faulty and need fixing. But by reducing human beings to machines in this way, so that discontent, estrangement, and so on are seen as forms of mental ill health, the institutions of psychology shore up the status quo. They present the acceptance of the status quo as good mental health. It needs to be understood that there is no good scientific evidence to suggest that there are biological deficits or genetic abnormalities or chemical imbalances related to specific mental ill health or mental disorders. The evidence base for mental illness is very poor by ordinary scientific research standards. There are no medical tests a doctor can give you to test if you have a mental illness. The happiness demanded by the so-called radicals of mental health campaigns buys into the secular, postmodern imperative of the well-adjusted, adapted individual, alienated by the modern metaphysics of the self. Our modern state of being, of becoming increasingly unhappy and distressed, not mentally ill, is no doubt created by economic conditions, amongst other things. But it is also the result of the pathological inability to enjoy the myriad satisfactions offered to purchase, or life statuses we are encouraged and tempted to acquire in contemporary society. The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan from France was very knowledgeable on the issue, the fact that the modern demand for happiness and the existence of the happiness and mental health industry implies the ultimately unsatisfying nature of customer satisfaction. Just think of the discussions on sexuality and pornography, etc., we've just had. I mean, so and the unlimited appetites we have, food, sex, or drugs. I mean, these are all applicable. None of them taken in excess ultimately make us happy. So, back to Scotland specifically, mental healthism was used in the development of the named person scheme, which morphed into the adverse childhood movement, adverse childhood experiences movement. I think people, parents and professionals need to be aware of this creeping totalitarian ideology in Scotland, seeping into the lives of families and children. The tentacles of the state do not just turn up overnight. They grow via faux compassion and fake evidence. The adverse childhood experiences movement is about love and hugs from the state. And some have been seen to tweet on social media such things about it's all about love, and nursery workers show love to their child, blurring the boundaries of the parent and the family and the state. Indeed, presently in Scotland and in England too, primary school children are subjected to resilience training or promoting mental well-being in schools which derive straight from the adverse childhood experience ideology and focuses on children's well-being, psychosocial health and relationships. In school, lessons are in effect psychosocial educational interventions based upon a very narrow and reductive idea of mental health. Essentially, it's based kind of upon the cognitive behavioural therapy model and group therapy model as used in group therapy situations. Children as young as 5 are asked to reflect upon relationships, the emotions and their families' emotions and relationships. Psychological projection tools are used which encourage such reflection and yield much information, data, on children's families, lifestyles, struggles, problems and difficulties. This is very coercive. It's little children in a group situation. If one child says something about their family, they'll be inclined to dish up data or information on their family. It's very coercive. Anecdotal reports are suggesting that younger children are becoming confused and distressed with this aspect of the school curriculum, which is an adverse event in itself. And these lessons are conducted without informed consent or consultation with parents, because they're essentially a psychological treatment. There have been reports of parents asking teachers if any data is being taken or recorded from these lessons. They have been told that no data is being taken or recorded, yet posters designed by children themselves, guided by teachers, adorn the walls of schools, worryingly anonymised, describing the emotional states, worries, trials and traumas of children and their parents. In one school I was in, I seen how a little girl described how her mother was in bed for weeks on end after the birth of her little sister. These sort of things are alarm bells for the Scottish State Social Service Department. It seems that the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, mean little in this ACE-inspired world. Data is everything in a totalitarian, surveillance-inspired world. Data leads to control. Anyhow, the ACE-inspired school is an instance of the school being turned into a mental health centre. These curricular developments are wholly inappropriate. The school is not a place where you meddle with the mental health of a child or extract information from them on issues pertaining to mental health and well-being. There are specialist services and professionals to work with children if they need help. They are called the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. But these services are overstretched and some are at breaking point. So what exactly do ACE advocates, the Adverse Childhood Experience advocates, want to do once they have identified all these ACE victims? Where will the ACE advocates send children for their treatments? And what treatments will they receive when there's limited resources already on offer? I think Aldous Huxley's thoughts on the issue of mental healthism are very helpful. This is from his Brave New World Revisited, where he quotes the psychotherapist Erich Fromm. So this is what Huxley wrote. But let us beware, says Dr. Fromm, of defining mental hygiene as the prevention of symptoms. Symptoms as such are not our enemy, but our friend. Where there are symptoms, there is conflict, and conflict always indicates that the forces of life which strive for integration and happiness are still fighting. The really hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be the most normal. Many of them are normal because they are so well adjusted to our mode of existence, because their human voice has been silenced so early in their lives that they do not even struggle or suffer or develop symptoms as the neurotic does. Therefore, the rise of a therapeutic mental hygienist totalitarianism, or despotism as Huxley alerts us to, is, I believe, alive and well in our times, in Sturgeon's SNP dystopian vision. One just has to think of the failed named person scheme in Scotland, which has morphed into the Adverse Childhood Experiences movement. Essentially, an ideology of the going in at birth and infancy of the child to target at-risk mothers and families, and where state knowledge and state intervention is necessary to guide a child into and towards a standardised unity where diversity is extinguished, targeting a pre-crime ideology, ideologically speaking. I've written about this in the Scottish Review, if anyone wants to check them out, the articles I wrote there. But essentially, if we ignore the warnings from the likes of Huxley, and to not heed the lessons from totalitarian pasts and from current totalitarian states, we are heading into a dark place. This is essentially so in the light of the drive of the ACE ideology with its whiff of eugenics, transhumanism, and the desire to link artificial intelligence with biological symptoms. I think personally human civilization is on a precipice mirroring some dark dystopian science fiction movie, except it is not a movie anymore. This is all the more real when you consider the trans or queer theory-inspired educational system, critical race theory infiltration in all walks of life. And just to give a little anecdote, I heard of a colleague of my wife whose son is at high school, 15 or something years old. He's standing for the school council. And there's about 20 of them standing for positions in the school council in this high school. And about 3/4 of them regard themselves as LGBT. And he's, the boy's, he's white, and he's a cis male. And he was accused by one of the other candidates that he was a bigot because he was white and he was heterosexual. So that is what's going on in the Scottish schools. But anyhow, from a document about brainwashing and mental healthism, this is the ex-head of the KGB, Anatoly Beria, and he states in regard getting mental healthism integrated into a country or a culture. And before I quote him, think of the LGBT clubs in schools and human rights indoctrinations and values and critical race theory. This is Anatoly Beria. Psychopolitical operatives should at all times be alert to the opportunity to organise for the betterment of the community, mental health clubs or groups. By thus inviting the cooperation of the population as a whole in mental health programmes, the terrors of mental aberration can be disseminated throughout the populace. Furthermore, each one of these mental health groups, properly guided, can bring at least legislative pressure against the government to secure adequately the position of the psychopolitical operative and to obtain for him government grants and facilities, thus bringing a government to finance its own downfall. The downfall mean moral, bringing down of the family, traditional values. The standardisation of human behaviour from a Soviet communist perspective, leading to a mental healthism, or the mental health of the population dependent upon the state, is backed up from the testimony of Dr. Boris Sokolov in his book White Nights, Pages from a Russian Doctor's Notebook. Here he shows why the neoliberal goal of a cultural hegemony of mental health and a leftist, communist mental healthism achieves the same outcome: servitude or slavery to a monosystem. He writes, Russian communism is generally considered to be fighting capitalism, whose defeat is its prime goal. Actually, of course, the Soviet regime, being an extreme form of state capitalism, is fighting not capitalism as such, but private industry and commerce. But much more important is the fact that neo-communism is a movement directed against individualization and toward the standardizing of all human beings' activities. It is the farthest reaching attempt ever made in this direction. Steadily and persistently, the Soviet regime is driving toward its ultimate goal, control of human behaviour. It states officially that man can transcend his heredity and transform his environment and so achieve full uniformity of behaviour. In his gigantic social and biological experiment carried out largely through the miseducation of children and youth, the Soviets are using the Pavlovian conditioned reflex mechanism on a large scale: fear, punishment, torture, etc. They openly declare that this is essential to their purpose, that through such standardization, a complete hold over the subjugated peoples can be attained. End quote. And just as a side issue, think of the use of psychology during the COVID-19 pandemic. The use of psychology to produce fear in the population has been used to great effect, unethically, breaking the rules of the British Psychological Society. Now, Hannah Arendt described totalitarianism as the attempted transformation of human nature itself. However, this attempted transformation only results turning sound minds into sick minds. Arendt's fear is exemplified by the attack on our children and the traditional family via interrogating heteronormativity and gender and deconstructing via postmodernist ideology, the pursuit of truth via the God of science and the godless, narcissistic pursuit of the ideal self, which is played out in the cultural hegemony of mental health, or mental healthism, where the self is made into a god. So just a couple of suggestions, and I'll end with a quote. Essentially, my own personal suggestions would be to not teach children to pathologise their own minds or to focus their attention on their own minds. To do so, I think, is very abusive. To use this kind of cognitive technology, which is a technology, is a very dangerous thing. For example, if someone's regarded as schizophrenic, for example, to start using mindfulness meditation, for example, can be very harmful. So a child's young mind at a very early stage of development, to start making them hyperly, obsessively focused on their mind, has detrimental effects. I think one should teach diversity of how to deal with human experience, philosophical, spiritual. Life is not just about a cognitive version of the human mind. And take queer theory out of schools, which mental healthism is a part of that postmodernist tentacle. But to end with a quote from Martin Lloyd-Jones from his book, The Christian Warfare, an Exposition of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 10 to 13. He writes, "Our age is one that has largely ceased to believe in the supernatural at all. This is partly due to the advance of science in its various branches. Man is regarded as the master of his own fate and the determiner of everything. It is my belief, as I have tried to show in my exposition of the Apostles' warnings, that the modern world, and especially the history of our present century, can only be understood in terms of the unusual activity of the devil and the principalities of powers and darkness." So, thank you.